And often the things we do are not very obvious, and sometimes they're challenging, and helps for people to know what we try to do. Sometimes it might be trying to preserve a factory or something that we don't have a good chance of preserving, but we're still there to remind people that this is a valuable historic site. So, first of all, Happy New Year to you all. I was at the Squire with the Duke of Ukes coming back to town. They're a local band, but they've been floating off to New Orleans and other places, and they came back and played twice at the Squire. So there was quite a large population of people there. I thought we might just throw a little bit of Duke of Uke. So it's a novelty orchestra with a tuba and a ukulele, and these are people who have been very local.
And of course, by tuba, he means the really large brass instrument, not like a potato. So here's a quick track from the Duke of Uke and his novelty orchestra.
Well, don't you think we could be so happy? Don't you think we should give it a try? Don't you think we could be so happy? Well, don't you think we could be so happy? Don't you think we should give it a try? Don't you think we could be so happy? Well, can't make no combo without the road. Why singing and complain to the day that I found you? Don't you think we could be so happy? We can be so happy. Well, don't you think? Don't you think? Don't you think? Yeah, yeah. I hit it now.
That's a group led by David King and a bunch of people who have other avocations. I talked to Anna Holhotter, who used to be the art director for Urbana City, but then got a master's degree in landscape architecture, and is working in Chicago as a landscape architect, and she gets to use some of her art background. And then there's Rachel Burlingame, who lives just a few blocks from here, who's the drummer and recorder of what they arranger of programs. And I asked Anna if she was able to find a similar group in Chicago, and she said, well, no, we get together, but this is a rather unique group, and it is, and people were dancing, and so it was a nice end to the old year, and the new year came in. So with that, I would like to launch into more or less a report on educational resources in environmental science, which is our mother company, and Heartland Pathways, which is the Rail Trail and Greenway group, and the Prairie Monk, which is this program from which we promote some of the environmental issues that we're concerned about. The overall objective of these three bodies is the preservation of prairie and the associate preservation of rails and trails along abandoned railroad beds. We'll start off with educational resources in environmental science, which has been going now for over 30 years. And it was the outcome of noticing that there was almost no prairie left in a state that was once 2/3 prairie. And so our initial efforts were to encourage groups that would promote prairie preservation. And often we've been involved in innovative things rather than taking the project on ourselves. So I'd like to report on some of those groups that we have worked with and who have done very well to preserve prairie. It's not easy to preserve prairie. It's much easier to buy a forest or a wetland. It's not easy to recreate or to preserve a remnant prairie against the tremendous desire for agricultural opportunities. The soil is very, very good, and so we sort of maintained that thrust, and with a lot of help from the public, from other groups, and it's a little on the loosely knit side, but very much we're been engaged with the community in a number of different places, and we are trying to computerize ourselves to the extent that we are more functional, and that includes this program that you're listening to now. We give examples of some of the things that we've done over the years. That doesn't mean to say that we're the total providers of the services we're talking about, but in many cases it's the initiation. So the Natural Areas Study Group has now been going as a docent group which develops awareness for over 30 years. The Grand Prairie Friends, who is a concept of having a group that specialized in prairie preservation, and they have done a wonderful job for the best part of 20 or 30 years, and acquired land and preserved prairies and gathered seeds and made people aware by running a Rattlesnake Master Run for the Prairie, which we again initiated and ran for 7 years. So we had a first prairie conference at Muhammad. We taught reading the landscape at Parkland College, artist in the landscape at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. We helped to preserve a prairie on Route 45 south. Some of the plants that, when that was widened, went to Lake Park Prairie, a private prairie, but it's 3 acres of very nice prairie. And we can perhaps give you a link to the photography on that prairie, because we record summer growth and also going into the fall. So we have just shown at the Sierra Club a sample of 2 hours on the prairie in fall. We've spun off the Heartland Pathways, and that has been a big deal. We did it before there was any Rail Banking Act to help us. It was 33 miles of corridor that's basically 100 feet wide, and it has gone back to trails in some cases and prairie preservation. It's fortunate that the corridor, the railroad corridors, were not invaded by, or usually not invaded by, adjacent farmers. That wasn't always the case, but the railroad law tends to favor prairie preservation. We preserved or initiated the preservation of Shady Rest, which is a 30-acre one-time picnic ground on the banks of the Sangamon River. It is now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve with tax base and in perpetuity. It's also on the Sangamon, so it joins a bunch of other land acquisitions between Mahomet and Decatur, that riparian corridor. So Shady Rest is also where a train may come down one day and load water into a steam engine the same way as it did in the past, and perhaps that same train could deliver interested parties to Shady Rest, which is now a nature preserve. The Greek Revival Cottage was a little building sitting near the University High School in between Urbana and Champaign. It probably was a small house lived in by someone who was reasonably sophisticated, and when he got enough money, he seated this little cottage across the landscape in wintertime and put it as a rental house, and put a bigger building on the site. So the Greek Revival Cottage has a Greek Revival porch and data which indicated that the owner had a real knowledge of architecture. So that was eventually, with the aid of the Historic Museum and the Urbana Park District, it was put on wheels and run down Springfield Avenue, up Wright Street onto University Avenue, and it was located in Leal Park in Urbana. It is now the Urbana Park District headquarters. The Kickapoo Trail is another one that we had instituted. We proselytized largely to get people to look at that corridor. We had spent about 10 years developing an awareness of that corridor and its possible value, 5 miles out to the north and south, the Lincoln Trail and things like that. When the time came that it was abandoned, we had a window where we could apply for an interim trail use agreement. The feds had decided they were losing too many railroads, and they wanted to encourage their preservation by allowing bicycles to use the corridor. So this offered an opportunity to buy the corridor, to preserve its bridges, to control its titles so you didn't have to go around the world to get to the other side. And there was money given to, not to the purchase, but to the development of the trail. So at the last moment, we took this on ourselves and did it. Eventually, the CCDC wanted to take over because they thought it was a very good idea, and they've done so. Unfortunately, they didn't get the money immediately, so that meant that the railroad CSX took it over and sold it 5 miles by 25 feet to road widening. So we lost some prairie, which was part of the concept of buying it in the first place. But the Kickapoo Trail is going into action with a budget of approximately $12 million, and we're pleased about that, but we had a lot to do with the initiation of the interim trail use agreement.
A quick question. You've mentioned this a couple of times that eventually it turned into a widened road. What if they had actually come up with the money, CCDC had come up with the money and had started trying to turn it into a trail, but then it turned out that they wanted to widen the road. Wouldn't the people wanting to widen the road have just been able to overrule turning that into?
Yes, there's eminent domain. So it might have been taken anyway, but you at least would have had the opportunity to argue the point about it. And that's what we didn't get
Okay, all right.
with that situation. Perhaps CTCC and others have argued that point, but we did lose valuable prairie soil and prairie plants. Rattlesnake Master Prairie Promotional, I'd mentioned already. The Pope Prairie Restoration at Rantoul is part remnant prairie, part garden, planted prairie. We do seed collection and prairie plant sales and native landscaping. We haven't done as much of that now, but years ago we did a lot of that. We created prairies in places like Arcola and around the region that not only preserved prairie plants, but they acted as a promotional and an awareness situation. The Sangamon Bridge Trail is a trail that is on our right-of-way, but it is built and paid for by the city of Monticello. It's a very popular trail. It goes across the Sangamon River on a truss bridge. It's quite a popular trail, and that trail is now being extended to the developments on the west side of the Sangamon River that are part of Monticello City. We have a warehouse that we use to work with grad students and others to facilitate signage and storage of equipment. We attempted to preserve the Pepsin factory in Monticello, which was a grayfield factory that was typical of economic development in this region. Pepsin was discovered by Dr. Caldwell, who would import seneca leaves and squeeze the pepsin enzyme out of them, and this was good for stomach problems and was very popular. So the factory grew from being in a storefront to being in a Pyatt family house to being a factory that could support 250 employees and have a railhead out that provided what now has become Pepto-Bismol that is used around the world. And so we felt that this was a historic factory that indicated the principle of the discoverer, the entrepreneurs that wanted to develop it, the entrepreneurial families that gradually got degrees and moved out, and the batch process was obsolete because most pharmaceutical factories want to have a continuous process. And the factory by 1980s was beginning to run down. The roof was leaky and would have cost $1 million to restore. Very substantial building, and it cost $1 million to take it down. But we worked on that and hoped that it would preserve. In the long run, there were only very few of us that were speaking to its preservation and the preservation of its history in a very logical place next door to downtown Monticello. I'm reading here. We're interested in the historic rails that surround some of these resources, and in favor of what the Railroad Museum does in Monticello. We have a pocket prairie in downtown Urbana, downtown Champaign, which is quite popular and has created an awareness of prairie. We have had artists in the landscape galleries. Our silkscreen prints are of art quality and sell well, although we haven't been promoting that so much. We've mainly been out there trying to preserve prairies. We've supported a lot of interns and volunteers who are interested in doing preservation work. So that sort of is a summary of what ERES is about. It's the mother company that supports this sort of work. One of the main agencies that is supported was Heartland Pathways. When we decided to buy 33 miles, that's about 330 acres of prairie, 3 truss bridges across 2 major waterways, and ambience that is part morainic and part across river systems. When we decided to do that, we begged for support from local communities. That was not forthcoming, but as soon as we bought it, then local agencies tended to feel that that was a very good idea and they would like to take over that sort of thing. So that has happened to some extent, but we did a lot of all of the initial work to get that line. And that was long before there was any rail banking act that would have helped us with finances or titles or bridges. And some of our bridges were taken out by mandate so nobody would jump off and cause a liability. They were taken out before we actually bought the bed. And so we lost some bridges that we will have to replace. If we had taken out this agreement, the bridge over the Vermilion River at Hillary near Danville would probably face the same fate, except that after a rail trail opportunity was provided, the railroads had a chance to buy if they wanted to, and CSX was buying quite a bit of land in and around Danville, and they, when CCDC was not able to get money for that corridor, they bought, and so they would also wanted to preserve the bridge. Bridges can be cost up to $2 or $3 million to replace, so that was important. So we have the 33 miles to the west, and now we have the Kickapoo Trail, which is to the east, and you have to imagine that Champaign County is rather flat and very fertile and is good for corn and soybeans. But for recreation, we have to go to Vermilion County, Piatt County, DeWitt County, and other counties that have moraines and rivers and are attractive to us. So although we are flat and don't have some of those resources, we have people who use the resources around us. So we have been involved a lot in the likes of the Kickapoo Trail. The trail will eventually connect a number of little, or not so little, communities. It has the potential to go back to rail, and we're not afraid of that because the railroads are efficient energy users, and you hear on the radio 1 ton of freight, 400 miles, 1 gallon of gas, 1 driver, up to 200 cars, a safety record that far outstrips anything on the road, and the main lines are using that, and the main lines are increasing their pace by improving trains. They have trains now that you don't have to hump together, but are trains that you load shipping crates onto with a gantry crane. We still need the semi-trailers to bring those shipping containers to the train and to deliver them. But the railroads are providing shipping opportunities that didn't exist before, and they're providing trains that are quite modern and don't disconvolulate you. Just put your load on them and send them back again, and you see them going through Champaign all the time. Well, so we're interested in the fact that you dream you might even have an interurban between Mahomet and Champaign-Urbana and St. Joe running on this bed. You might even have industry in Danville, which we don't know about now, that politicians might decide to put an industry somewhere like at Fithian, and you could use the rail bed. That's what the Rail Banking Act is about. If you look at the bed between Chicago and St. Louis, it goes through Bloomington, and Bloomington connects to Indianapolis. So if you're looking at railroad networks, you might have that happen. It's not likely to happen quickly because the railroads are mainly interested in main lines, and they have hubs that are like 300 mile apart. So Chicago and Memphis, or Chicago and Atlanta are sites where trains are loaded and unloaded. If we're going to use them as a trail, these trails allow communities to communicate with each other. A kid on a bicycle can go 5 miles to the next town, or and it upgrades towns. You have a shop and a restaurant, and so universally there's now about 1,500 of these trails, and all of them have been tremendously popular to the extent that the railroads are worried if they're ever going to get their railroads back. In that case, they don't necessarily give over their abandoned railroad, they keep it for themselves. So that's when they're looking at things like a fast track between Chicago and St. Louis, and a connection from Bloomington through to Indianapolis. On either side of that trail, there is the rest of the 100 feet can be relatively undisturbed prairie soil and prairie plants, and that's what the Kickapoo Trail is basically about, and that's what Heartland Pathways was interested in doing. The first fundraiser for the matching funds for that project brought in $37,000. Sierra Club and Champaign County Design and Conservation Association Foundation were both involved in that promotion. So we hope that you will help that cause. It will help us in the western 33 miles where we are facing some invasion, and we would like to use this as a demonstration. Monticello has a nice rail trail which has been very helpful because it's popular and interesting. And we hope that this one, it'll take about 2 years to design and get into action. It's starting now, but it'll be probably 2 years before it's available generally to the public. But we're encouraging your help. Adjacent to the Kickapoo Trail from Urbana to Danville is Route 150 widening from Urbana to St. Joe. That's excuse me. That's about 5 or 6 miles, and it does take a piece of prairie out of the adjacent rail bed, but the road will also be raised up, and we're hoping that we get to plant prairie on either side, and we hope that that prairie won't be mown to death, that it will be a conservation easement that will ensure that we won't have plants that are mown, but plants that are prairie on the side of the roadside, where the prairie soil that has been remodeled has pushed up against the roadside. It's not under the road. Under the road, gravel and underpinnings will be more substantial, but there is like a bird bath at just east of Urbana where water accumulates, and the road will be lifted up and the prairie soil will be on the side. We hope it will get used for prairie and reconstruction. On Route 45, we've been faced with Ameren increasing its grid capacity. So they've been putting up towers that are 100 feet or more tall, and they need to sit on a pedestal that is sometimes 60 feet down and 10 feet across, or at least 6 feet across. Some of the lesser towers don't need as big a pedestal, but where there are junctions, they need big pedestals, and they have been working. Their easement is on our prairie on between Windsor Road and Curtis Road in Savoy, and that prairie is long-standing, but they were, since the easement is there, they took 100 foot by 100 foot square around each new tower and around each old tower, and used that as a construction easement. They did that after they'd mown it, which was helpful to us because we don't favor the trees that are on this corridor. We try to keep them out, and most of the Route 45 prairie is free of trees. That's short to power lines. But there's a site near Windsor Road which is very difficult to handle, and their equipment could mow the trees that were there, and that was very helpful. We're not quite sure what has been planted. There's some difficulty in working with big projects like this. You have to talk to the administrators who might be in St. Louis or Chicago and get their permission, and then you also have to watch to see that the working end of the construction knows what you've been permitted to do. So most of the working crews are not used to working with prairies. They regard the weeds along the railroad line and between the road and the railroad line as weeds and subject to use to for their purpose. But we've been doing a little bit of educating there, and we hope that the prairie will return. It's a very public prairie that can be viewed by people on Highway 45, and we hope that that will be there for many generations. When the road adjacent was widened from 2 lanes to 3 lanes and then to 5 lanes. We did take excess prairie from that contract to Lake Park. So we have a Lake Park prairie that is where a meandering stream was dammed for a lake, which is the Lake Park Lake, and then the gooseneck of the meander was made a bypass for water. That bypass moves fairly quickly when water is moving, so it erodes, and one of our tasks at Lake Park was to stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. It's a nice little 2.5, 3 acre site that allows you to walk around, and it has probably about 50 different species on it at different times of the year. So you can walk it many times and enjoy it in many different ways. If you have a visitor and you're taking them to the airport, or you're bringing them from the airport, you can stop off at that location and show them something of what is a very good facsimile of what a prairie looks like in this region. It's our ecosystem. At Monticello, we have the Sangamon Bridge Trail I've mentioned, and then that trail will go round to Applewood, which is the subdivision a little to the west, and then from there on there's 4 miles of railroad bed prairie that is rather nice, and we've been working to preserve that. Chris Calf, a grad student in landscape architecture, has been working on that corridor, and he's been eliminating a lot of invasive autumn olives. So we have also been working with Allerton Park, which has an elevator there, a whole wooden elevator we hope will stay. We are adjacent to the old Route 47, which parallels the railroad line. Well, when the railroads went in, there weren't any roads. When the roads came in, they often paralleled the railroad line. And that highway has now been replaced by Interstate 72, which takes most of the traffic. So we think that that corridor could be a shared bicycle way with appropriate markings and signs from Monticello to Decatur. And on the way, you would go to Armenia, which is part of the Allerton Park complex, and then allow you to access to Allerton Park. Both Monticello and Allerton Park have been generating plans for bicycle ways. Monticello has had a Farnsworth group that has submitted a plan, and that plan includes networking across the country, and in our case that's between Monticello and Clinton, and perhaps on further. Monticello has an east trail, which we haven't had anything to do with except we support it. It's on an old interurban which parallels the main line, which now is owned by the Monticello Railroad Museum. The Monticello Railroad Museum doesn't exactly want a bicycle way through their museum, so Monticello is trying to work out how to get past the Railroad Museum and then perhaps work with the museum to get a trail into White Heath. It's not necessary that it be on the railroad bed. It could be on traditional roads, quiet roads that bicycles could use and actually go past cemeteries and places that are of interest. at Whiteheath, from Whiteheath to Seymour, Heartland Pathways owns a bed, but we've been working with a new group called the Champaign, Havana, and Whiteheath Railroad. It's a historic railroad named after the first railroad that was in that area, and they have already cleared the ballast from Whiteheath to Seymour, and that corridor is available for use. We have one bridge to repair there. A bit was taken out with that liability clause which said that when a railroad was abandoned, you must remove the bridges. That corridor is also a good prairie, and we collect and sell seed from that corridor. It's a little bit dangerous when you get to Seymour. There's a temptation to ride into Champaign on Route 10, but Route 10 is fairly heavily trafficked, especially with trucks going to the landfill at Clinton. So we encourage people to go south a mile and get onto the Kirby Avenue, which goes into Champaign in a more relaxed manner. But going back to Whiteheath, there was a Y there, so the trains could go from Champaign to Monticello to Decatur, and then up to Clinton and back to Whiteheath and into Champaign. That junction there, we own from there to Clinton. The first 3 miles of it is rather interesting, and it goes over the Sangamon on one of our truss bridges and crosses over a tributary to the Sangamon, and so that creates bottomlands of interest. And then you climb up to Lodge, where the railroad bed meets the Norfolk Southern Railroad. We're anticipating that corridor will be developed for railroad to go down from Whiteheath from the Railroad Museum to Shady Rest, which we had a lot to do with preserving, to the Sangamon River, where the trains used to take on water. They had a big water tower there. The pedestals are still there, and the water was pumped up so that a train could take on water quickly and move on up. Later they had a water supply at Whiteheath, which was pumped up from the aquifer, and I suspect that's there because when you stop a train at the bottom of a hill, it's hard to get it moving again, especially if it's well loaded. So trains preferred to get their water at a high spot where they could stop rather than a low spot where they didn't have the momentum to go up the hill to pull a load of grain up the hill from a starting point. If we can't make a connection with Norfolk Southern, and you can't really easily join a historic railroad to active line, one of the dreams is that you might be able to create a 23-mile circuit from Monticello to Whiteheath to Lodge, and then down the Norfolk Southern to Monticello and back to the Railroad Museum and back to Whiteheath. That's a circuit. It would be 23 miles. Probably won't ever happen, but the railroad could go down to Shady Rest, across the truss bridge, which Mrs. Price, who owned Shady Rest, really wanted to see preserved, and then across Shady Rest Road and across Madden Creek and up to Lodge. and then back again. It's not unusual for historic lines to have a terminal point, and sometimes they put in 2 rails so that they can take the engine and put it on the front, because people more used to engines being on the front of a train than the train pushing backwards. So with a little bit of organization, that could happen. It's not just a little bit of organization, it's a lot of organization. So we're thinking beautiful thoughts there, but they're extensive. We hope that once you get to Lodge, the railroad line continues to DeLand, Weldon, and Lane, and Weldon State Park, where they used to bring in trains to deliver people to Chickasawas, and meetings and religious events. And we're hoping that the Kickapoo Trail will act as a demonstration to improving that corridor. It's facing a little bit of invasion at the moment by farmers on either side, and we have to work with that. So we have a legal challenge, and we have had for years the wonderful pro bono help of Bob Dodd, who was a priest and who was also a mayor of Champaign and also an attorney, and he did a lot of pro bono work for us and understood what we were doing for a long time. He died, and we were working with his company, and we need those services. Some of those services are costly, so we because we can no longer expect pro bono services that Bob Dodd provided. There are other sites that we have in places like Arcola and the Pope Prairie in Clinton, and we have dreams about a trail, a prairie trail, going from Pope Prairie north of Clinton all the way to Paxton on an old Route 45 that parallels the new Route 45 and is a concrete slab road which could easily be a bicycle way. As usual, these bridges and culverts have been removed for liability reasons, but they could be reconstructed, and so that when we're looking at the future, we're looking at the possibility of that sort of corridor. Coming back to town, we have our office building at, and from that we do a lot of salvage work, and so that becomes part of what we do and how we teach. I brought some, I have a problem with salvage where people throw their pop out and they don't empty out the bottle. That means that somebody has to pay for that water, that fluid, that drink to go 35 miles to Clinton and be dropped in the landfill. So I have a New Year's resolution that people should empty out their water bottle when they've finished it, not send it to the landfill at a great cost. I also note that these sorts of bottles have up to 40 ounces of sugar in them. It's a small handful of sugar, and that is leading to problems that we have, medical problems. So we hope that in the future we can convince the entrepreneurs that produce sugar in all manner of foods to change their mind. We would like to see people use paper cups. Mike and Molly's next door to us uses paper cups, and we can salvage them. If we don't happen to salvage them, they rot in the landfill rather than create a plastic. we're in favor of the people who are working on preventing PVCs from going into the landfill and leaching into the landfill at Clinton, on top of an aquifer that is contributing water to perhaps 850,000 people. So we're interested in policy as well as in actual day-to-day preservation. We've spoken to you a little bit about the Prairie Monk. That's myself, but it's an attempt to bring you information about environmental issues, and we have our radio program courtesy of WEFT, and we have that transpired to a TV program on Urbana Public Television, and then that it goes up to YouTube, so you can get it at your convenience rather than having to listen at 11 o'clock on Sunday. So we're getting near to our end here. It seems to come up very quickly. I have to say that this week there was a Christmas fire at Atwood, and I have to warn you that houses, especially frame houses, get very dry in wintertime, and you should maintain your boiler, because if it goes out and misbehaves, then you can lose your whole building. And that happened in Arcola, not Arcola, but Atwood just recently. So be careful of your heating. It's rather marvelous that we can all have heaters and they're very responsible, but keep your eye on them. And I think I want to say that if you need to get hold of us, this is Dave Monk. I'm president of the group, loosening a bunch of consortium of groups, Educational Resources in Environmental Science, Heartland Pathways, and the Prairie Monk. And you can get us through 217-351-1911, 217-351-1911, or my cell phone, 217-840-1911, or, and I'll repeat that, 217-840-1911, or through monkdavid0@gmail.com, monkdavid0@gmail.com. And we do thank you for all your help over the years. It's been hundreds of people that have helped us do these things we do. And we hope you have a productive new year and connect with us sometime. I think this. Okay. So we added to this report a report for Atwood, because there's 4 houses there that are rather unique, and I thought it was too much to include, but we'll come back with that. It's a situation where the Harshbarger family had first a log cabin. So when you settled the area, you had to have a house to live in, and you had to live in it within a year of your taking up a settlement. So mostly those settlers settled in the woods, Atwood, and so the second house was a frame house, probably, I guess, perhaps built in the 1850s. And then there was an Italian, as you got into the Victorian era, you had a big Italian 8 house that was 2 stories high and brick, and that probably provided for a very large family, because in those days, large families were helpful to run the farm, but they were also often died. So you had large families because you would lose some of those families. Sometimes there were accidents. It wasn't easy living in the Victorian era. After that, probably in the 20s, there was a bungalow built, and so the Hausberger family had, at some stage, lived in Indiana. Then they'd come to Atwood, and they lived at the Twin Forks, two streams coming together, where Native Americans would come from Vermilion County, where they'd overwintered in more rambunctious territory, come to Atwood, where they kept a stash of arrowheads and axes and things like that, and they grew vegetables like cucurbits, pumpkins and corn and things like that, and beans, and they the settlers came. Those rivers were often joined together where there was a moraine, and so there was a morainic situation there, which was drier, and settlers settled there. The lumber was available. The agriculture was in the forest because you couldn't be out in the prairie because it was damp and very swampy and had malaria. So when Grandpappy Sidorus came to the area, he got bogged and actually stayed there, and that's why we have a Sidorus village now. So something likewise might have happened at Atwood, but it was different. The railroad came through about a mile south of the woods, so most of the frame houses and early buildings were trundled across, slid across the snow in wintertime to the new railroad. And actually, the last occupant of the cabin house was a Hausberger who probably was a greaser on the trains. The trains had to be greased fairly regularly so they didn't destruct. So that little complex of 4 houses is rather unique in this state, and it needs to be watched. But that was very near where there was a fire recently. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board.
And thank you for listening.